On the morning of June 16, 1976, in a dusty, sprawling township just outside Johannesburg, South Africa called Soweto, thousands of children made a choice. They chose to march. They carried no guns, no shield, no armor, only their books, their simple uniforms, and their unwavering voices. They marched against the decree that forced them to learn in Afrikaans, the very language of their oppressors. But by the end of that day, their simple uniforms were stained with blood. The Soweto uprising had begun, an eruption that would shake the world and forever remind history that even the youngest among us can spark a revolution. To truly understand the explosion in Soweto, we must first understand the system that contained it. Apartheid. Apartheid, meaning apartness in Afrikaans, was not merely segregation. It was a comprehensive political and legal system imposed in 1948 by South Africa's white minority. It was meticulously designed to keep the black majority poor, voiceless, and perpetually controlled. Every single part of life was divided. Where you lived, the hospital you went to, the places you were allowed to visit, and even the bus you were allowed to ride were determined by race. White South Africans, a mere 15% of the population, controlled the land, the wealth, and the power. In contrast, the black majority comprised over 70% of the country's people, yet they were treated as second-class citizens with no political rights. For black South Africans, life meant daily oppression. Passbooks dictated where they could travel, police raids were common, and townships like Soweto were packed and choked with poverty and limited opportunities. The cruelty was codified in the schoolroom. In 1953, the government passed the Bantu Education Act. Its cold, clear purpose was to ensure that black children could never receive the same quality of schooling as their white peers. The architect of this policy, Prime Minister Hendrik, stated it plainly. There is no place for the Bantu, meaning black person, in the European community above the level of certain forms of labor. To actualize this, the government spent roughly 10 times more on the education of a white child than it did on a black child. In short, the policy was a blueprint for servitude. Black children were trained to serve, not to lead. Anger fueled by decades of this systemic dehumanization had reached its breaking point. The devastating spark came in 1974 when the government decreed that Afrikaans, the language of the white ruling minority and the state apparatus, would be the compulsory medium of instruction for key subjects like mathematics and history in all black schools. This was a profound insult. Afrikaans was not the mother tongue of these children. Most spoke indigenous African languages or English. To them, Afrikaans was the language of police orders, of court trials, and of the oppressive system itself. One teacher famously called it the language of the oppressor. Imagine the imposition. You must learn core subjects in a language you barely understand, a language you associate with those who control you. Teachers themselves resisted. Some schools outrightly refused, but the government simply pushed harder and harder. The students, however, had reached their limits. On June 13, students' representatives met in secret. They had formed the Soweto Students' Representative Council to coordinate a protest. Their charismatic 19-year-old leader was a high school student named Sishi Mashinini. It was Mashinini who gave the call to action. It was he who led students from his school to converge with others, marshalling a force of peaceful protest. On June 16, thousands of students, many no older than 12 or 13, left their classrooms. They wore their school uniforms, carried handmade placards, and began to march orderly through Soweto. Their destination was Orlando Stadium. Their message was simple yet revolutionary. Down with Afrikaans, equal education now. The singing did not last. Police were waiting, blocking their route. Tear gas canisters were instantly hauled into the midst of these children. Some students panicked, others enraged threw stones. Then came the terrible sound that shattered the peace. Gunfire. The first child to be shot was 15-year-old Hastings Ndlovu. Moments later, 12-year-old Hector Peterson was struck down. That single shocking image, the lifeless body of Hector carried by fellow students and his sister screaming beside him, instantly captured the raw, murderous horror of the apartheid system. The peaceful march had become a massacre. The news of the police brutality spread like a firestorm. Soweto immediately erupted. Students fled, regrouped in raw anger, and returned to the street. The long simmering frustration boiled over into revolt. Government buildings and businesses seen as collaborators were set ablaze. The police and security forces responded with greater, merciless brutality. They fired live ammunition indiscriminately into crowds, raided homes, and pursued students relentlessly. Leaders like Sishi Mashinini were forced into hiding, then into exile, becoming global fugitives. The uprising was too powerful to be contained in Soweto. It spread like a wildfire across the country, to Alexandria, Cape Town, and Pretoria. For weeks, massive protests and clashes shook the very foundation of the regime. The government cracked down hard. Detainees were routinely beaten, tortured, and interrogated. Every day that children left home, parents lived in profound fear. The true number of children and young adults that died remains fiercely disputed. The Apartheid government grudgingly admitted to around 176 deaths. But this was a cruel deception. What is certain is the horrific scale of the state's violence. Records show over 3,900 wounded, with at least 2,300 shot by police bullets. Nearly 6,000 people were officially arrested in connection to the protests that year alone. Those were not hardened fighters. They were children, teenagers, students who had yet to demand a fair education and who paid the ultimate price for their courage. For years, the apartheid system had hidden its cold brutality, but the sheer scale of the Soweto uprising and the fact that its victims were children made secrecy impossible. The tragedy exploded onto front pages worldwide. Foreign newspapers printed Hector Peterson's shocking photo. Images of uniformed children being shot in the streets horrified citizens around the globe. International organizations immediately mobilized. Governments and powerful human rights groups universally condemned South Africa. Economic boycotts and sanctions, which would slowly, painfully strangle the regime, began to seriously mount. The uprising had turned international eyes firmly and irrevocably on the cruel reality of the apartheid system. The Soweto uprising did not topple the apartheid regime overnight, but it marked an unmistakable, irreversible turning point. The young people had proven that they were not afraid. They had created a new, fearless wave of activism that would sustain the long, difficult struggle for freedom into the 1980s and beyond. Many of those SSRC members and young protesters would grow up to become the leaders of the post-apartheid nation. Today, June 16 is rightfully remembered as Youth Day in South Africa, a national holiday honoring those who stood up and those who paid the ultimate price. The image of Hector Peterson and the legacy of leaders like Shishi Mashinini stand not just as a tragedy, but as a perpetual reminder that change is often carried on the shoulders of the young. The Soweto uprising is not just South Africa's story. It's a fundamental warning and a necessary lesson for the entire world. It reminds us that language is identity, that education is power, and that even children armed with nothing but their unified voices and their courage can shake the deepest foundations of tyranny. On June 16, 1976, the children of Soweto stood up, and history has never forgotten their demand.